Hello everyone. In this video I will be discussing my personal political philosophies as they relate to the broader political landscape. During this discussion, I will attempt to give an accurate summation of political theory, insofar as it relates to the ongoing evolution of ideologies that humanity has historically integrated into civilizations and governments. I will be speaking from a logical and philosophical point of view, or more specifically the epistemological perspective, that is, the study of the nature, origins, and limits of human knowledge. With that said, the first thing that I will do in order to help you better understand my position is to express what it is that human beings are capable of knowing, and thereby express why I believe what I believe. Then, the last part of the discussion will include a historical timeline showing the relative origins of political theory, and how it has transitioned into the modern political discourse which we are having presently. There are really only two types of claims that you can make about the world as they relate to political statements, or arguments in favor of a particular political ideology. They are descriptive claims and normative claims. Now, these two kinds of claims will oftentimes get conflated for one another, making it difficult to truly justify your position to someone who may initially disagree with you. However, the differences between each type of claim is of supreme importance to today's discussion. If you don't already know, descriptive claims are factual claims about reality. For example, you are watching a YouTube video right now. This is a descriptive claim about a fact which none of us should reasonably dispute. If you do dispute it, chances are you would be in the minority and might adopt a more solipsistic view of reality. Now, normative claims, on the other hand, are claims about how things ought to be. Instead of saying you are watching a YouTube video, now I could say something like, you ought to be watching a YouTube video. Notice how this claim is one that you could easily dispute. Maybe you don't think that you should be here now watching this YouTube video. Or maybe you don't feel like watching my content in general for whatever reason appeals to you. In any case, you should therefore recognize that there's a difference between what is and what ought to be. Some of you may think that observable facts are enough to establish an ideological framework for society, while others may think that more is required to get from what you observe to what you believe ought to be the case. Essentially, what we are discussing is referred to as the is-ought dilemma, which is to say, we often make statements about what ought to be based upon what is. The reason that this is problematic is because we have not yet discussed the reasons why things exist as they are. We also haven't discussed whether things always ought to remain the same, or if change is permissible or even necessary. Descriptive claims therefore only let us understand what is, not what ought to be. Making an argument for what ought to be requires more than an appeal to what is. For a potentially more relevant example as it relates to politics, we may observe general differences between individuals who identify as men versus those who identify as women. This phenomenon is referred to as sexual dimorphism, which states that, on average, the male and female of a given species will tend to exhibit specific traits which align with their biological sex. However, just because we can observe what is, we cannot necessarily use that as a basis for what ought to be, or even what ought not be. Therefore, all members of the male and female demographics may not and need not share enough traits respectively within their own demographic in order to form a monolithic standard for how each sex ought to look and behave. Specifically, all who identify as men may not and need not be strong, domineering, stoic, or assertive, just as all who identify as women may not and need not be delicate, submissive, emotional, or reserved. These are typically referred to as gender roles, which society expects us to live up to even if this expectation is largely subconscious. Now, I am a gender abolitionist, meaning that my personal take on gender roles is that people's roles and responsibilities in society shouldn't be based upon how they identify or even how they appear, but rather upon what skills they have and where their interests lie. This same principle can be applied to any immutable trait that humans possess, such as race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, or even the family you were born into. None of these things are under your control, and so they shouldn't be what dictates your place in this world. Now, whether or not you accept an argument like the one I just gave is not necessarily contingent upon what you think, but rather how you think. There are two primary modes by which we approach political discourse of this kind. They are consequentialism and deontology. Each of these modes are similar in that they have axiomatic assumptions from which they are derived. If you are a consequentialist, then your axiomatic assumption is that the moral value of an action is contingent upon the consequences that action yields. If, however, you are a deontologist, then your axiomatic assumption is that the moral value of an action is inherent to the action itself. As an example, if we as a society believe that lying is only wrong if it consequently brings harm to people, and isn't wrong if it doesn't, then we allow for the possibility of lying as a means of escaping a perceived harm, even if the perception is illegitimate. If, however, we believe that lying is always wrong, then we can no longer assume that there are cases where lying would ever result in a net positive for an individual or even society as a whole. If the distinction between these two approaches isn't already apparent, then let me elucidate further. I, as a consequentialist, believe that it is wrong to kill people depending upon the consequences of doing so. This allows me the opportunity to justify killing someone, such as a fascist dictator, because doing so might result in the prevention of oppression and mass genocide. If I were a deontologist, at least with regards to killing people, then I could never justify the killing of a fascist dictator, but instead must devise an alternative method of preventing oppression and genocide from occurring, which may be two more things that I consider to be immoral actions in and of themselves in order to preserve my deontological stance. It could be argued that one of these positions might better enable the rise of fascism than the other. Though even if we can't agree that one solution is more or less effective than the other, we can all at least agree that fascism is a problem. Hopefully. Another reason that I'm a consequentialist is because I recognize that actions have lasting consequences. Whereas a deontologist sees killing as wrong in and of itself, I see killing as wrong for the harm that it causes the person you killed, their family, friends, and other loved ones. This allows me to first acknowledge the people who were harmed and then assess the nature of the harms done. If done in reverse, one may focus too heavily upon the actions taken and ignore the people who these actions affected. Deontology tends to focus more so upon the actions taken and thus places more emphasis upon the person whose actions caused harm. This makes the character of the perpetrator and which punishment should be issued to them more important than focusing upon what can be done to compensate the people who were harmed. Okay, so I have essentially just finished laying the foundation upon which my worldview rests. From here I will carefully detail the structure of my worldview itself, which I will do starting with a relatively brief history lesson. Disclaimer, I am not a historian, I'm a philosopher, and so what I am about to present is not a comprehensive view of history, but rather a general overview of how political ideologies have evolved over time. So here's a basic timeline that I have put together, which shows the chronology of some of the numerous political philosophies originating from the beginning of human civilization. Despite it not being the objective first political ideology of all time, let's start somewhere useful for modern-day political discourse. Feudalism. Feudalism was the dominant social system in medieval Europe, in which the nobility held lands given to them by the crown in exchange for military service. Vassals were in turn tenants of the nobles, while the peasants, or serfs, were obligated to live on their lord's land and give him homage, labor, and a share of the produce notionally in exchange for military protection. Now, of course, there was more that came before feudalism in terms of how human civilizations governed themselves. In fact, not all civilizations adopted exactly the same series of political ideologies that we know of today, at least not in the same order or even during the same time periods. Though for the purposes of our discussion today, this continuum of political ideologies will be helpful for our understanding of the overarching history of politics from the beginning up until now. So what is important to note about what was going on during the time when feudalism was prevalent is that there were political attitudes trending towards anti-egalitarian and anti-democratic thought. The primary reason for this is that the monarchs or lords were considered to be appointed by a god or deity of some kind to rule over the land, and to lead their subjects to a glorious and prosperous future, so long as these subjects continued to serve and obey the law of the land. The bloodline of a given royal family was not simply considered to be special when compared to everyone else. They weren't just healthier, more enlightened, or more educated. No, they were divinely chosen by the gods to sit upon the throne and rule over their kingdom or empire. Subsequently, it was also believed that only certain members of society were capable of engaging in political discourse. In addition to the monarchy, these usually only included members of nobility, aristocrats, scholars, and so on, due to the fact that they were the only ones able to read and write. The vast majority of people, the peasantry, were not considered to be political agents. The average farmer and blacksmith not only didn't have political representation, but they also lacked the fundamental political agency that you and I are privileged enough to take advantage of today. Peasants were instead considered to be dumb animals, which were to be moved about like pawns on a chessboard, only to serve the whims of official political agents. Of course, the average peasant was uneducated, likely diseased, and had little else than their labor to contribute to the world around them. So why even bother granting them something as important as political representation and agency? Well, due to an increase in wealth funneled into a growing middle class of merchants, scholars, and students, over time, the balance of power began to shift in favor of those who weren't considered to be appointed or chosen by the gods. This balance of power manifested itself into something we now call the Enlightenment. Honestly, it's rather difficult to overstate the extent to which the Enlightenment and the values that followed from it affected civic, philosophical, and political discourse throughout the world. Democracy. Hey there, peasants, you exist in this kingdom too, don't you? You're affected by its laws, so shouldn't you have a say in those laws? Self-determination and freedom. Hey, wouldn't it be nice to more or less do the things you want to with your life and not suffer under the imposition of a self-appointed higher authority, so long as you are not also infringing upon the freedoms of others? Free trade. Hey, instead of you being obligated to give up your resources to the nobility and lords of the land so that they can profit off of your hard labor, what if people could trade freely, which would allow them to moderate and make decisions with their own wealth and production? Incredible, that would lead to more individual freedom. What about Republicanism? That is the idea that, rather than having every individual human being in society individually determining their own political future, they could consolidate their political strength into political representatives, who would then vote in their best interests at the Capitol. Amazing, right? It's actually rather mind-blowing that such a large collective of free-thinking individuals could come along, challenge the divine right narrative of the monarchy, and in doing so would shape humanity's future for the better. Over the course of just a few decades, this collective of ideas, which had existed even long before the advent of the Enlightenment, suddenly reached a breaking point. The Enlightenment exploded onto the scene, relatively speaking. Whereas just 50 years ago, scholars would talk about Machiavellian theory, the divine right of kings to rule, and how the orchestrations of the upper class were necessary in order to keep the subservient peasant class in line. None of that anymore. We got what we now refer to as Enlightenment-era thinking, also known as liberalism. Even if no one watching this video considers themselves to be an Enlightenment thinker, or even a classical liberal, as it were, most of you nonetheless derive some measure of your values from the Enlightenment. Now remember what I said about free trade? It's all well and good to say that people should be free, though you still need to devise systems which will allow people to actually be free. You can have people represent themselves democratically, but how are you going to do that if the vast majority of people cannot read or write? In order for a democracy to function, citizens need to have access to a public education. If you want people to be able to represent their own interests, they need to have access to a minimum level of education necessary to do so. Education, by the way, is something that I'm personally very passionate about, as you should know from being a subscriber of this channel. I care about education for its utility in improving ourselves both individually and collectively. However, a good education isn't really enough all on its own. Just because a populace can vote in their own interest doesn't mean that they live in a system that encourages freedom. A system that encourages freedom, such as a representative democracy, direct democracy, or even a combination of the two called liquid democracy, should be able to boast economic freedom as well. Economics is important, especially after transitioning from a kingdom to a nation-state. In order to live, you need to work, same as before, though this time you are being compensated for your labor in more ways than military protection and other forms of security from the ruling class. Something needs to be done with all of this new wealth pouring in. The question is, how do we allocate all of these resources? Who gets access to what and how much at a time? Also, how do we prevent those who already hold the majority of wealth and resources from keeping it all for themselves? Enter Adam Smith. For those watching who don't already know, Adam Smith was a Scottish economist and author, as well as a moral philosopher, a pioneer of political economy, and a key figure during the Scottish Enlightenment, also known as the father of economics or the father of capitalism. The economic system, which was supposed to unequivocally solve all of the problems of inequality, intolerance, and unequal representation in the modern world, is known as capitalism. No longer would kings and queens, tyrants and aristocrats have sole authority over the economic output of a society. With capitalism, free trade and free association means that you, as an individual citizen, have the right to go out into the world and sell your labor to someone offering work. Capitalism represents everything that the Enlightenment was supposed to be about. The ability to do with your life what you want, and the ability to eschew old-world values of anti-egalitarian segregationism. Why would you be racist or sexist in a capitalist society? Discriminating against a constituency would only have negative market outcomes, because the more productive and educated a subset of the population is, the more economically prosperous they will become, which in turn benefits the entire economy. Needless to say, there were some problems. Believe it or not, capitalism didn't end up solving all of the problems that the old world brought about. Divisiveness, anti-freedom sentiments, authoritarianism, segregationist principalities, it didn't solve all of what the Enlightenment sought to correct. Adam Smith himself recognized some of these problems in his book, The Wealth of Nations. He recognized that these problems didn't just manifest out of nowhere. It was always known that capitalism was to be an experiment, and experiments don't always go as planned. Now, obviously, capitalism isn't without merit. Capitalism was ingeniously able to take advantage of the material conditions of the Industrial Revolution. In just a couple of decades, we went from as low as 1/20th of the citizenry living in cities to about 1/2. The problems, however, were still rather abundant. Factory work, coal mining, these were absolutely brutal jobs. People were shacked up into tenement housing with 2 to 3 families to a single building, substandard insulation, fires inside factories. These were such miserable circumstances of the time. Though despite how terrible everything was, the overwhelming increase in wealth that came with the Industrial Revolution, aided by capitalism, increased the overall productive force of the participating economies 5-fold, 10-fold, 100-fold even. I know that this may be difficult for any of us to imagine, but for a very long time in Europe, all you had was a nice shirt for church and a shit shirt for working the fields. If a hole appeared in either one, it was of the utmost priority that hole be repaired, because you were almost certainly not getting another shirt. In just a century, we went from that to a society in which an ever-growing middle class was capable of not only consuming, but consuming excessively. To think that anyone but the aristocracy was capable of excessive consumption was a very new idea. For millennia, something like that would have been conceptually unfathomable. Now, I consider myself to be lower middle class, and even I have a closet with several articles of clothing. Even the poorest members of modern society have access to free clothing programs, which are primarily donation-based, so even they are living a better life than the average peasant of the Middle Ages. Though, for all the good capitalism has done and even is doing today, it did not succeed in its original promise to end inequality and promote freedom. If anything, the divide seems to be getting greater and greater. It used to be that there was only the ruling class and the peasantry, and that was about it, give or take a few merchants and academics who were not born into nobility. The pyramid scheme was pretty flat, with a very wide bottom and a very narrow top. The peasants, along with the growing middle class, massively outnumbered the ruling class. Capitalism, however, came along and stretched out the pyramid vertically. Certainly at the top of society you have the bankers, CEOs, and heads of state. But now you also have millionaires and billionaires. Upper middle class making 6 figures. The middle class who get to enjoy luxury goods but still live paycheck to paycheck. Then you have the poor who don't get to enjoy many luxuries and just barely scrape by. And then even absolute poverty, the homeless, disease-ridden, and destitute. Well shit, I guess nothing really got better after all. Seriously though, while more people in society were given the means to climb the ladder of power and wealth and become self-actualized, i.e. the American dream, nothing significant has changed in terms of the mechanisms that fuel inequality. Inequality didn't get fixed by capitalism, it just got stratified into several more layers. It may have allowed more people to be nearer to the top, but it didn't end inequality. If anything, it made systems of inequality more stable. In the past, systems of inequality were less stable, because a system by which there are only a few thousand aristocrats and royalty lording over millions of peasants, the peasants need only but heave their shoulders and rise up. At least need only but shrug and the aristocracy falls. Though now the uber poor, at least in this country, only make up a relatively small portion of the overall American population. The higher tiers of society, however, while better off financially, still depend heavily upon the stability of the systems that are in place, growing increasingly dependent upon material and luxury goods. Not to mention that as a society gets more complex, subsistence living gets more difficult. This means that if capitalism were to be completely done away with, it would become harder and harder to live without the current governmental structure which we've all grown accustomed to. So in the end, capitalism didn't turn out to be the system it purported to be. There were plenty of antagonisms between the freedom capitalism was intended to bring and the actual inequality it wrought. I'm also not the first person to recognize this either, hence why a growing number of people are now working toward a better alternative. Socialism. What if we took the basic foundational structure of capitalism, free association, free trade, etc., but instead of the government enforcing property rights in such a way that privileges the owners of business, what if they enforce property rights in a way that privileges the workers? What if instead of workers working for a wage with the excess profit of their labor going towards the company's owner, what if there no longer was an owner, but instead the workers themselves owned their own labor within the company, and company profits were distributed to the workers according to the work they put into the company? Crazy idea, right? Workplace democracy is a heavily contested idea these days, despite the economic efficiency and equitability it brings when implemented correctly. From as early as the 1920s, scholars have been exploring the idea of increasing employee participation and involvement. What was sought was to learn whether including employees in organizational decision-making would lead to increased efficiency and productivity within a given organization. In addition to increased efficiency and productivity, it was found that individuals who are involved in decision-making also have increased openness to change and growth. Certain cooperative techniques can either have a stronger impact on morale and productivity, while others can have the reverse effect. Success of the employee-owned and operated Mondragon Corporation, for example, a federation of worker cooperatives based out of Spain, suggests an economic net benefit from workplace democracy. There's also a citizenship argument to consider for worker-owned cooperatives. Workplace democracy acts as an agent to encourage public participation in a government's political process. Skills developed from democracy in the workplace can transfer to improved citizenship and result in a better functioning democracy. Workers in a democratic environment may also develop a greater concern for the common good, which also transfers to fundamental citizenship. There are certainly ethical justifications for workplace democracy as well. Making workplaces more democratic is considered by some to be the morally right thing to do. If democracy is justified in governing the state, it must also be justified in governing economic enterprises as well. What about employee power and representation? Workers working for democratic leaders report positive results such as group member satisfaction, friendliness, group-mindedness, we statements, worker motivation, creativity, and dedication to decisions made within the organization. When workplace democracy is used, the effect is raised employee potential, employee representation, higher autonomy, and equal power within an organization. The economic pyramid would once again be flattened. Though, unlike with the feudal model of society, the bottom 99% wouldn't be poor peasants with no representation and political agency. They would instead be productive, self-actualized middle-class citizens. The top 1% would include leaders elected by the people, and no one would ever be able to hold an uncontested position of authority over anyone else ever again. Socialism can bring us back to a flattened hierarchy, wherein systems of inequality would be optimally reduced, to the point of being virtually negligible. The egalitarian principles of the Enlightenment would finally come to fruition. It's certainly been long enough. We've at least been talking about doing these things for quite a while now. So, as a result of the general outcry for change, socialists have been fighting to make these things become a reality, which we've all been wanting to happen for decades now. Though, some people argue that flattening the hierarchy isn't enough. They argue that this divide, the system reproduced through capitalism and altered through socialism, while they have their benefits, there is still a distinct malaise to the ways in which these types of societies incentivize human behavior. So some people, some radical thinkers, took it even further. They brought us Anarchism and Communism. Now, even though I am an anarchist, I have to be honest that anarchism and communism have never historically succeeded as stable governmental structures. Don't get me wrong, though. There have been very successful anarchist and communist communes, villages, cities, and other small-scale human societies. Though, in the experimental sense, in the true global revolution, anarchist and communist large-scale societies haven't actually come about yet. The reason for this is that some prominent anarchist, communist, and socialist thinkers believe that there was a specific path to follow, which would require the cooperation of most of the citizenry of whatever size society we are hoping for a revolution to occur in. Capitalism brings about a substantial increase in economic efficiency, and through socialism the mechanisms of capitalism are tempered and forged into something that actually values egalitarianism. Then, from socialism, a system which values egalitarian practices, such as workers' rights and the end of wage slavery, then we can go truly radical. Once you've established true Enlightenment principles for society, then really the sky's the limit. Who knows what kind of egalitarian societies we can forge going forward? No state? Sure, why not? No borders? Yeah. No class? Absolutely. An end to all forms of hierarchy. Sounds great. All of this in service to the Enlightenment principles which humanity collectively agrees are of significant importance. Equality, fraternity, justice, all of these are fundamental to the growth and development of human civilization. To move into an anarchist or communist society would be to follow the same trends that have led us this far into socialism. By the way, for those of you who aren't aware, despite still using a capitalist structure, we do live in a socialist society currently, or at least it's the current economic and governmental experiment being developed right now. Even if you aren't a socialist in theory, you are likely a socialist in practice. Do you pay taxes? Do you benefit from any kind of social program, such as Social Security, food stamps, unemployment, and so on? Do you use public roads to get to and from work, school, doctor's appointments, etc.? You see, we are no longer just living within the capitalist framework. In fact, the next step forward for humanity will be to dismantle all of the inherent systems of inequality that have existed since feudal times, became more stable through capitalism, and have only seen recent pushback since the implementation of modern-day socialist practices. Eventually, we should arrive at a structure which hardly even resembles capitalism anymore. Some people argue that anarchism, communism, and socialism are all simply alternatives to the more modern interpretation of liberalism. Personally, I don't agree with this sentiment. I think that they are improvements upon liberalism and the original plan of the Enlightenment. They are critiques and responses the same way that socialism is to capitalism and capitalism is to feudalism. Though, unfortunately, not everyone believes that the ails of capitalism are best addressed in this way. Socialism developed academically, which is to say that people like you and I looked at society, took note of its problems, complained to the right people in government about them, and formulated solutions. Some of these solutions have caught on and are currently being practiced in government, while others haven't succeeded either due to an inherent flaw in the proposed solution or due to a misapplication of an otherwise functional solution yet to be implemented effectively. Fascism, on the other hand, did not develop academically. Now don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that fascism just emerged out of nowhere. There have been authors of fascist literature, though that wasn't why fascism came about in the first place. While the writings of fascistic thought may have existed in academic circles, they were far less numerous and substantial than the writings of anarchist, communist, and socialist thinkers. Therefore, when fascism had its heyday, it was not due to the literature that it came about and maintained itself. It was never supposed to be a deliberate plan for the structure of humanity, in the same way that socialism is currently. Fascism arose due to a phrase that some of you may be familiar with: economic anxiety. Fascism is a response not just to capitalism, but also to the Enlightenment values that preceded it and which inform it. You see, the mistreatment of the working class, the subservience of the working people, the domination of the capitalist class, the agitation and alienation from one's own productive labor, all of the criticisms of capitalism made by anarchist, communist, and socialist writers looked at how the system impacted people negatively, and sought to correct them. They considered the humanitarian perspective, which seeks to optimize the health and well-being of everyone. However, some people argue that the problems which arose from capitalism stemmed not from the misapplication of the original principles of the Enlightenment, but rather from the Enlightenment itself. Fascists believe that things like egalitarianism, equality, and freedom not only didn't pan out correctly in a capitalist structure, but are actually harmful pursuits in and of themselves. Humans aren't meant to work together cooperatively. Humans are meant to exist in a hierarchy and compete against each other for scarce resources. The strong are meant to dominate the weak. Those within the same racial groups are meant to primarily or even exclusively cohabitate with their own kind. And men and women are meant to have distinct social roles in society. This is fascism. Now, of course, we should all be aware of some examples of fascist governmental structures throughout history. We're all familiar with Nazi Germany. We should all know about Mussolini and Stalin. Some of us may have studied Japanese history and should be familiar with the Japanese fascist empire. Though, what is fascism specifically? Because obviously each of these examples have differences between them, right? Due to the fact that anarchism, communism, and socialism arrived academically, there are very easy ways to pin down what these things are. Fascism, on the other hand, is not so straightforward. Fascism is best described by Umberto Eco's 14 Common Features of Fascism. If you are interested in learning more about fascism, I would strongly recommend looking into his writings further, though for the sake of time I can only summarize each point without going into greater detail. Now, before I summarize each of these features of fascism, let's think carefully for a second. Why is the best that we can do in determining what fascism is exactly only establishing a list of common features? Why is fascism as a political theory so very incoherent? The full answer to this question is much more complicated. Again, for the sake of what time will allow for, I can summarize why fascism is so incoherent for you in one simple statement. Fascism is incoherent because incoherence is the point. Have you ever heard someone say, or, more often the case, seen someone behave in a way that would suggest they believe something akin to the following? You can show me all of the evidence you want. I don't care. That's your truth, not mine. If you tell me something that I don't like, I will ignore it, and will instead appeal to some conspiracy theory which I personally deem more credible. Not all of us need to get our information from books and other academic sources. I usually go with what my gut, instincts, and common sense tells me is true. People who speak and behave this way do not fundamentally care about objective reality. What I mean by objective reality is the same reality that all of us can observe and agree exists, once we get past all of the semantic terminology which shapes our own personal worldviews. In essence, we all agree upon a lot more than we probably realize, and most misunderstandings between individuals and groups comes down to the terminology we use and the ways in which we articulate these terms. The only thing that a fascist cares about is which systems of beliefs, which policies, and which actions will bring about the correct triangle. In the mind of a fascist, the world is hierarchical. Therefore, our government ought to be hierarchical as well. This gets back to the same is-ought dilemma which I was discussing at the beginning of this talk. Now then, let us quickly go over these 14 common features of fascism, and then I will wrap up the discussion. You may not believe this, but fascistic beliefs are quite common. In fact, you may hold a fascistic ideal as part of your own core beliefs, possibly without even realizing it. However, not being fully aware of potential fascistic elements of your own worldview doesn't necessarily mean that you are absolved of responsibility for thinking or behaving the way that you do. In fact, you are the only person responsible for your own thoughts and actions, or at least you should be as an autonomous agent. If you are concerned that you may have vestiges of fascistic thinking incorporated into your current set of beliefs, then a small amount of time and self-reflection may help you better understand your own position. Maybe ask yourself some important questions like the following kind. Do you have certain long-standing traditions that you follow which exist for no other reason than it's what your family and ancestors have practiced for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years? Maybe these traditions extend beyond family lines and even into certain community-wide practices. Do you ever find yourself excessively criticizing modernity or social progress in favor of preserving a more noble or moral way of life? Do you struggle to adapt to changing times and perceive new things as depraved, immoral, or otherwise in conflict with your current set of established beliefs? Do you prioritize action over thought, if for no other reason than to appeal to a sense of boldness, adventure, and otherwise risk-seeking behavior? Do you believe that any criticism issued against your way of thinking is tantamount to persecution, or, in the case of questioning the integrity of one's preferred political leaders, treason? Do you find yourself being overly concerned with people from foreign lands invading the place that you consider your home, or otherwise intruding in spaces that you are used to sharing with people who look and think the same way that you do? Do you find yourself thinking of you and others as members of different classes or social demographics more often than you consider who each of you are as individuals? Does thinking this way cause you then to expect social frustrations to exist where they wouldn't otherwise, if you were in fact more interested in the personhood of the individual? Do you feel like others are plotting against you, or like you are under attack from others who might disagree with you? This is probably the most common sentiment that even the most progressive-minded people feel from time to time. This is due to the fact that many of our current leaders use fear and obfuscation as a means of pitting us against one another ideologically, so that we are unfocused on our efforts to establish a more equal and just society for everyone. Though we are each still responsible for tempering our own fears and biases, even if we didn't ask for them to begin with. Do you perceive an enemy that is both too strong and too weak simultaneously? For example, do you simultaneously believe that immigrants are here to steal American jobs, but are also lazy and mooching off of the system? Do you believe that achieving peace and mutual understanding is a pipe dream, and that constant struggle and competition are inevitable? Do you value strength and look down upon weakness, once again reinforcing the ongoing need for competitive thinking? Do you secretly feel more powerful than you actually are, almost as if you are superhuman? What are some of your favorite stories from your childhood which may have reinforced thinking of yourself this way? Do you like weapons, explosions, and other blatant examples of machismo? Do you find yourself deeply interested in the idea of fighting in a war or serving some purpose greater than yourself, willing to give your life for said purpose? Do you believe that in our future there will be a television or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected majority group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the one true voice of the people? Do you find yourself actively criticizing intellectualism, and the idea that you don't have to be educated in order to be informed? Are you okay with simple answers to simple questions? Do you prefer not to ask the harder questions, or not think that you have to work as hard to get the correct answers? If you answered yes to a majority of these questions, then I'm afraid I have some bad news for you. It's okay though, because the internal structures of fascism in our society rub off on all of us from time to time. However, the important thing is how we address our own behavior and thought patterns, because doing so is critical to how we approach the problems facing our world. So to summarize my position, I am a consequentialist, an Enlightenment thinker, an atheist, a socialist, an anarchist, and an anti-fascist. My core axiom is that I want to maximize well-being for the greatest amount of sentient life possible, and I think that my political values reflect this axiomatic statement. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below, subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell to get regular updates on new content as it becomes available. Consider supporting me on Patreon if you value my work, and leave a comment below because community feedback is invaluable to the success of this channel. Until next time, thank you guys for watching.